In this lesson, we're going to learn more about circles in the coordinate plane and using their equation to come up with the center and the radius of the circle. And if you recall from the previous lesson, we had this formula given to us that's called the center radius form of a circle, which means you can easily see the center, which is HK. Remember, you switch the signs, and the radius, you take the square root of r squared, and that'll get you the radius of the circle. So if you wanted to be able to graph the circle, remember you have to know the center and you have to know the radius. The center is the starting point and the radius is how far you go around each direction from the center to be able to come up with your circle. So this equation gives you everything you need. However, there's a form called standard form of a circle equation where it looks like this example number 1. And when you see this form, you can't easily graph it because you can't easily see the center or the radius. So what we have to do is we have to do some algebra. If you remember from algebra, something called completing the square, to be able to take this equation in standard form and rewrite it so that it's in center radius form. So this right here is in center radius form, and that's our end goal, because that's really what's going to be helpful for circles is if you have them in center radius form, because then you know the center, you know the radius, and maybe that's all you need, or maybe you need to graph it, and those are the two things that you need. So this first example, we have this is in standard form. So our goal, if we're trying to come up with the center and the radius, is to first get this into center radius form. So what I'm going to do, as I go through this process, I'm going to kind of write out my steps so that you can follow them in the future. So the very first thing that I do for this is I just rearrange this formula. So my first step I call the rearrange step. So really all that means, if you remember from completing the square, you got to get this 10 over to the other side. So you're going to subtract that 10 over. And also in my rearrange step, it means that I'm going to group any of my like terms, or I shouldn't say like terms, but any terms, x's together, my y's together. So they're not really like terms, but I'm going to group my like variables together. So I'm going to have my x squared, and then my 10x, my minus 10x, that's going to go together. And then I'm going to put this little box here, this little rectangle, because that means I'm going to have to add something there. So I'm doing that kind of as like a placeholder. And then I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to do it with my y's. So it's going to be y squared minus 2y. And now I'm going to add a triangle just to represent, again, a space that's going to be a different number than this rectangle. And then we have our equal sign. And remember, we brought that 10 over, so it's a negative 10 now. And then whatever you do to one side of the equation, you have to do it to the other. So that means I have to add that rectangle and I have to add that triangle, which are really going to be numbers. So right now it's just kind of a visual to help you remember that whatever you add to one side, you have to add to the other. So this is called the rearrange step. All I did was rearrange my x's so that they were together, my y's so they were together, move that number over to the other side, and then we added some space. Those spaces that we added are going to be what we call the completing the square step. So how do we know what numbers go in there? Well, we have to make this so that it becomes a perfect square trinomial, which means I need to find a third term in this trinomial, or right now it's a binomial, but I need to find a third term so I make it a trinomial so that when this factors, it's a perfect square. Hence the name completing the square. So you're trying to make it so that it becomes a perfect square. So the second step then is going to be what we call the completing the square step. And I'm going to show you how I like to do completing the square. Now it might be different than what you've seen, but I like it because it's visual. So I'm going to show you this way, and you could also do it the way that you've learned. So completing the square is my next step. And basically I'm going to draw out a square for each of these variables. So my x's, and then I'm going to draw out a square for the y in a minute. So the first thing I have to do is I'm basically going to figure out, well, what could I multiply together to get and make a perfect square trinomial? So what happens is the x squared, I'm going to break that up as x and x. And then the negative 10, what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide that by 2. So negative 10 divided by 2 is going to be negative 5 and negative 5. So then watch what happens when I multiply these. So if I multiply x times x, I get x squared. If I multiply x times negative 5, I get negative 5x. Negative 5x here, and then positive 25. So this number right here is the magical number. That's the completing the square number, because basically what I've just done is now I have an x minus 5 and an x minus 5, which means x minus 5 times x minus 5 is going to end up being a perfect square, because it's the same thing as saying x minus 5 quantity squared. But in order to have that as factors, my trinomial has to have a plus 25. So this 25 is the number that I add as my third term to make this a trinomial, because then what it does is it makes it have perfect square. It makes it a perfect square, meaning the factors are the same. So see how if I actually combine like terms here, I have x squared, and then if you combine the negative 5x and the negative 5x, you get negative 10x. So what happened is the part right here in the inside is the same thing as this x squared minus 10x plus 25. So really the only number that we care about is this 25. So you're going to see that I'm not going to always fill in these grids. I'm just going to say, okay, well, multiply those, you get positive 25. If you add 25 here, you got to add it to the other side. So that's kind of the explanation of what completing the square is. You're making this a perfect square. Your 25 is the number to make this a perfect square, to make the side lengths the same. So now what we're going to do, we're going to do the same thing for y. So I'm going to split up my y squared, so it's y and y. Then you're going to split up the negative 2, so negative 1, negative 1. And remember, I don't do anything with this y. Same thing here, I didn't do anything with the x, because naturally what happens is when you multiply the negative 5 and the x, you got the negative 5x. So then that's why you don't have to worry about that x. So you only worry about the number in front. You divided it by 2. And then remember, the only thing I really care about is this number right here. So negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. So that means you're adding 1 to both sides. So you don't have to fill this grid in. And remember, these sides should always be the same because you're making it a perfect square, meaning the sides are equal. So this is the number that's completing that square. So that's the completing the square step. Some of you might have heard of it as you divide the b term by 2 and then square it. That's exactly what I'm doing. So I'm taking half of this b term and then I'm squaring it. Totally fine. But this is just a visual. And then the next step becomes easy because now that I have my visual, I just have to rewrite the equation using the factors. Write equation using factors is my last step. So really watch what happens. My factors for this trinomial are going to be x minus 5 times x minus 5, which is really x minus 5 squared. X minus 5 times x minus 5. And then I have for the next piece, so I'm going to have plus between them. My next piece here, I have y minus 1 times y minus 1 will give me this trinomial. And then at the end, all we do is we just add these together. So negative 10 plus 25 plus 1, add those together and you get 16. So now hopefully you recognize this right here as your circle equation in center radius form. So again, repeating the process, all I did was I took my trinomial, or I took my binomial, and I made it a perfect square trinomial. So I made the third term, I completed it so that it would factor as perfect squares, meaning the same factors, x minus 5 times x minus 5. And remember, what's in the grid is equivalent to that trinomial. So now that I have my equation, I can finish this problem up by stating what the center and the radius are. So the center is going to be, remember you switch the signs, so 5 comma 1. And then the radius, you're going to square root the 16 and you get 4. So that's the last part. So let's do another one of these so you get familiar with the process. So I'm not going to write out the steps every time that I do it, but I do want to, I'll talk through them as I go ahead. So remember the first step is you're going to bring that 4 over so that you can rewrite. So I'm going to rewrite this so I have my x's together. So it's going to be x squared minus 4x plus a grid or a rectangle. And then it's going to be group your y's together. So your rewriting is your first step. So 6y plus a triangle. And then remember on this other side here, I have the negative 4 plus the rectangle that I added, because whatever you add to one side, you have to add to the other. and then plus the triangle. So my first step, remember, is just the rewrite step. Second step is where we complete the square. So now you're going to draw out your squares. So this is going to be split x squared, so you get x and x. Split -4, so you get -2, -2. Remember, those have to be the same. Multiply, you get +4. So the number that you're adding to both sides is 4. Then we're going to do the same thing for the y's. So split those up. Y times y will give me y squared. And then the 6 here, we have to break up, divide that by 2. So we get +3, +3, because remember, we need to be able to add to 6. So that's why it's +3, +3. And it has to be the same number. So then we multiply, and that gives us the number that we multiplied to. So that's going to be 9. So that goes here. And then our last step is to rewrite this using our factors. So for the x's, my factors are x minus 2 times x minus 2. Also the same thing as saying x minus 2 squared. Plus, then we have y plus 3 squared equals, and then remember, you combine these, so the 4's cancel, and we end up with 9. So there's my equation. And then for the center, we flip our sign, so it's going to be 2, -3. And then for the radius, square root the 9, and you get 3. So that's really it. So that's the process. So the first step, rearrange, then you complete the square. And remember, the completing the square, if you don't want to draw the grid out and you just want to take half of the b value and then square it, you can. But then the only problem is then you got to remember how to get the factors. The reason why I like the grid is because then the factors are right there in the end. So we're going to skip example 3 because if you didn't recognize it, it's the same thing as example 1. And then on the next page, just make sure that you have, for this example 2, make sure that you have x squared plus y squared plus 4x, and then this should be a minus. That way, it's not the same as the previous page. And then number 4, you're completely removing because, again, it's the same thing. So you only have the 2 examples to do using the process that we just talked about on the previous page.